Go ahead, gentlemen.
Hey everybody, welcome in to Barber's Bookstore's virtual Q&A. My name is Jay Zawaski from 670 The Score and the Madhouse podcast. With me is Adam Jahns of The Athletic. He is the author of The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Bears, which is going to be very hard for me to remember because I've said the name of my book, The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Blackhawks, approximately 7,000 times in the last 2 weeks. So thank you everybody for joining us. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat there. Also, you see the code on your screen if you want to save 10% on either or both of our books. Enter that code event and you'll save 10% on your order. So Adam, glad to be here with you tonight. It's a little bit of a different scenario than I think you and I probably envisioned when we started writing the book. I finished in December of 2019. When did you finish The Big 50 Bears?
Oh man, it took me, Jay, about a year, maybe 13 months for the whole process. You know how long it takes. It's the editing, it's the interviews. There's a lot of things that go into building a book, even about sports teams that have been storied so many times.
Yeah, that's sort of the challenge you run into. And what I liked about this project was it wasn't the top 50 or the 50 best players. So it gave us both a little bit of freedom with what we wanted to write, but then at the same time, compressing what for the Blackhawks almost 100 years of history, with the Bears even more, into 50 chapters was a bit of a challenge for me. I'm sure it was for you too. What was your process in sort of narrowing down the 50 chapters?
Yeah, when you're discussing, internally to yourself about keeping like a Bronco and the Gursky out of your book, like legendary names like Red Grange, those are icons in the sport of football, but you put them in there because you know how important they are. But for me, and I'm sure you struggled with this too, Jay, is there are so many stories from like the modern era. I'm sure like Corey Crawford, Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews, and all those guys. For me, it was Brian Urlacher, Owen Kreutz, Robbie Gould, Peanut Tillman, guys that I wanted the story. So deciding between them and Bronco Nagurski was definitely a challenge when it came to the chopping block.
Yeah, I think for me, and you sort of follow the same path as I know my mindset going into it. And when I was talking with Triumph Books about sort of my philosophy on writing the book, I thought there's been so much written about the old days, about Bobby Hull, about Stan Mikita, you with Dick Butkus and Mike Ditka and all these legends. I sort of wanted to focus on the more modern history because there hasn't been as much written about them. I know you took the same approach. Is there anything that what of the new guys? Because my favorite Bear ever is Olin Kreutz, aside from Walter Payton. I think that's a caveat with everybody.
Yeah,
every male from Chicago in their mid 40s, their favorite is by default Walter Payton. But I've always been a huge Olin Kreutz fan. Tell me about that chapter. Tell me what you learned about Olin writing that chapter.
So Olin and I actually had coffee together at a hotel in Lake Forest, back when you could have coffee together in person. That must, it feels like it was last year, but it feels like a much longer time ago. But just to have that personal interaction and hear like his side of certain stories, because there's so many Olin Kreutz stories. Yeah. And I just love getting those from whether it was, media members who have covered this team since the 80s or his former teammates. There's just so many of them. And you're right, he was a fan favorite. I still think he's a fan favorite. He's great on the Score. He's great on NBC Sports Chicago. And like to share his story through other people's stories about him, I thought was a good way to do it. And there's a lot of good ones. I don't want to ruin it, get the book, everybody. There's some, Olin Kreutz is a wild character. For me, like this is my question for you, Jay. Like, of course, my first chapter had to be Walter Payton. Like it was a no-brainer decision. I spent a lot of time with Jared Payton. We actually had cheeseburgers discussing his father, which was a really cool moment for me. But for you, I thought for a Blackhawks book, like who do you go with? Like I know who you went with, but there are so many options. I thought maybe more options for you to consider from a Jonathan Toews, even like a Coach Q. So how'd you go through that process?
Yeah, for me, it was a difficult process because the guy who made me love hockey is Jeremy Roenick. That's the guy who, planted the seed, lit the match, whatever cliche you want to use about it. Me watching Jeremy Roenick as a young adult, I was like 10, 11, whatever I was when he came into the league. That guy was everything that I love about hockey. He was fast. He was physical. He could score. He had pizzazz. He had personality. And I was drawn to Jeremy Roenick right away. But when you think about the history of the team, it's got to be someone who's won a Stanley Cup. It's got to be someone who holds some franchise records. So for me, the first guy I wrote about was Stan Mikita. He, to me, to this day, even though he passed away a while back, remains kind of the icon of the franchise. When you look at the kind of person he was off the ice, with the on ice, obviously the achievements on the ice are huge, but off the ice too, he was beloved. Everyone loves Stan Mikita. And to me, he's the guy who embodied the Blackhawks the most. And one angle I took with writing this book was, like we said, there's been so much written about these old time players, all these legends. And what I wanted to do when talking about those guys was give something new, give something different. So you'll see from the first chapter of the book, which is about Stan Mikita, it's called A Kinder, Gentler Stan. You'll sort of see, wow, I've read a lot of things about Stan Mikita. I never knew this about him. So if you check out the book, I think you'll learn a whole lot about him and about Tony Esposito and about Keith Magnuson, and not only what they accomplished on the ice, but what made them tick.
Uncovering new things
yeah,
was definitely a goal for me. And with Walter Payton, my first chapter was getting his son's take on his life. You know, the guy who grew up at Payton in Chicago, like that was fascinating to me to hear Jarrett's story. I spent a lot of time with Rick Tellner, the Chicago Sun-Times columnist, who was a close friend, who became close friends with Walter Payton. To hear his stories, I'm not going to reveal too much here, but to hear his story about walking through his North Barrington estate, the Payton North Barrington estate, with Walter Payton, and we'll just say Walter Payton had a bow and arrow, and he had a problem with certain trees on his property. Like hearing stories like that, I really wanted to share. And you're right, like I kept the modern days in context as well. Like Brian Urlacher is up there, Owen Krutz, like we mentioned. They are who we thought they were. Game. What stuck out to me about your book going through it is the injection of you know, like your fandom, and we both grew up Chicagoans. We're city kids, you know, Catholic school kids from Chicago, and to have, like, I kept the fan in mind. Like, so how much did you think of the fan and how much these teams are consumed by the fans? Like how fans consume the Blackhawks. How much did you keep that in mind while constructing this book?
That's the only way I knew how to write it, to be perfectly honest with you. I straddle this weird fan media analyst line that a lot of people in town don't really have to do, right? It's, look, everybody in town grew up Bears fans, and, you know, but the Hawks are my thing. And for me, the Hawks got good in a lot of people's minds, especially people who make decisions in radio, overnight. They were irrelevant, and then all of a sudden they were totally relevant. And Mitch Rosen, who was a program director at the Score and still is, looked around and said, who do I have who can talk about the Hawks? And there I was a fan. Everybody knew I was a fan. And I went through a long part of my time sort of as I was growing into the role of an analyst of trying to deny that fandom and trying to pretend it didn't exist. And I knew that that was making me miserable. The people that listen to me know I'm a fan. So once I got comfortable in my own skin with it, which is probably 3 or 4 years ago, I said, screw it. I am a fan in a unique position. So when Triumph asked me about the book, I said, how much of me do you want in here? And they said, well, there's a percentage of people that will be buying this book because you wrote it. And to hear that, just that sentence gave me a lot of confidence in saying, okay, then I'm going to stray away from a little bit of what would normally be written in a book like this, because I do think that my personal experience with this gives me a little bit of perspective, because there's diehard Hawks fans that are legitimate diehard Hawks fans that missed a decade and a half of Hawks hockey because they didn't have the patience I had. Right. So, and they were probably the ones who were right, not me. There's no shame in skipping the mid 2000s. They were terrible. There's no reason to stick around. So being able to interject a little bit of my personal life and my personal feelings in there made it a lot easier of a process, because I felt like when I was struggling with this doesn't seem as interesting as I thought it would be when just presenting the facts. Being able to add my own experience of it in there really helped move the process along. And especially with those sidebar chapters, there's a lot of those that are deeply personal. And I liked writing those the most because, what do you know better than yourself, right? I mean, the Hawks have been, there's the chapter called Baby Stanley about the birth of my daughter. The Hawks are a focal point in my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my daughter. There's been so many moments. My wife and I met because we're Hawks fans. My best friend set us up saying, hey, she loves the Hawks. You love the Hawks. Why don't you guys go to games together? We're like, okay. When I was in school at Lewis, I used to have to beg friends to come to games with me. Please, I'll pay for your ticket. It's $8. I'll pay for parking. Just come with me.
Come see Tyler Arneson.
Yeah, right. People were just like, I'm not really into it. I was gonna, you literally could not pay for people to come with you. So I found hope that way, and like that. Now we're married, 12 years, and our daughter just turned 10, and the Hawks have been part of our lives since the moment we met, which is pretty amazing.
So I covered the Hawks. You know that. We talked about it. Gosh, I remember being on the score with you back in 2010. That was my first year, my first season covering, the Blackhawks. Was the year they ended that drought, right? 49 years and won the Stanley Cup in Philadelphia. What I always found interacting with fans with the Hawks specifically, more so maybe than other teams, was how much of it is rooted in family, like tradition and going to the games, going to the old barn, right, with your father and stuff like that. It's just, and how, at least with the Blackhawks, it just felt different because they weren't on TV. They weren't always the darlings of the city, especially for a while, but that love was always there. And I remember Dale Talon telling me one day, this was just like a powder keg, just waiting to explode. And all they needed was something to ignite it. And Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane, Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, those guys did. So when you're going into the process, it's called the process, right? Building this book, this dynasty, like how did you break it up? Like who did you feel bad about leaving out? I know there's a chapter on Big Buff, but there were just so many characters from those teams, specifically 2010. Like how did you divvy up the word counts?
Yeah, that was difficult, especially with the dynasty guys, because we have this discussion on the podcast all the time. When the time comes, which numbers are getting retired, and you can make Kane and Toews for sure, Keith for sure, right? You can't. You have to put Seabrook in there. Then it's like, well, how do you not put Corey Crawford in there? How do you not put Marion Hossa in there? What about Patrick Sharp? It goes on and on and on. So writing a chapter, that's just the guys who are going to hang in the rafters forever, let alone all the guys who played huge roles. So one of the ways I solved that problem was I have a chapter called The Depth of the Dynasty, which when we look back on the success the Blackhawks had, yes, they were loaded with star players, but it was their third and fourth lines that were probably second and third lines on most teams that did a lot of the damage for the team because, sure, maybe your opponent can stop your first line and your second line, but when you keep coming at them with talent like that, it's impossible to defend throughout a whole series, and that's why they won. So the Dave Bowmans, the Nicholas Hjalmarssons, the Johnny Oduya, those lesser names who had huge impacts on the cup runs, they sort of got a chapter together. Dave Bowman, by the way, wrote the foreword of the book, which is really cool. Him and I had a little bit of a relationship going back to our hockey night events, where it took me 2 seasons to get Dave Bowman to open up. But once I did, he was great.
Yeah.
We got a question in the chat for you, Adam, from Lauren. She says, it's not a question, but a comment. She says, I love that there's a chapter in a Super Bowl shuffle. I still have the 45 of the Super Bowl shuffle on vinyl. What did you learn? By the way, it would probably be worth something had I not faked everybody's autograph on the vinyl cover. I was 85. I was 7 years old when that came out. So it was perfect for me. What did you learn about the Super Bowl shuffle when writing the book?
I think my first, and thanks for the question, Lauren, my biggest takeaway from writing that chapter is how much of a pain in the butt it was for those guys. I didn't realize how much of a process it was. Like we all grew up seeing, I think I've seen that thing 100 times. And it's probably a lot less than a lot of other Chicagoans, right? Like it's just part of your makeup growing up in this city. It was a pain in the butt for those guys. to do, and it's how it all came together through Willie Gault, and how they had to, edit for that time, whatever you wanted to call it, edit in, Walter Payton and Jim McMahon, because they did it on a racquetball court. But even the guys that have to go downtown and spend all day going down there, and then it was cool to even hear from Dan Hampton be like, I wasn't going to do any of that, or Jay Hilgenberg like, no, thank you. Like, I wanted to hear from the guys who said no to that. Like,
Yeah,
I thought that was cool. I thought that was kind of neat to hear from, because a lot of guys did, like some big names did. Dan Hampton's a Hall of Famer, and he said no, thank you. That offensive line, some of those guys wanted no part of it either.
well, and Dan Hampton is a great musician.
Yeah.
He plays, what did he play? Sax? I know he plays piano.
Yeah.
When he was hosting on The Score with Lawrence Holmes, he would do shows from home. We had a rack set in so he could do shows from his living room. In commercial breaks, we'd hear him playing the piano. If anybody should have been
Chicago Six, Chicago Six. Troy Murray was part of the original Chicago Six. There's your Blackhawks Bears, synergy.
There it is. Well, if anybody has a question, we've got a few in the chat we're going to get to here momentarily. Just feel free to hit the chat. Remember, with the code EVENT, you save 10% on both of our books. Adam's is the Big 50, the men and moments that made the Chicago Bears. Mine is the Big 50, the men and moments that made the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm going to answer this question here in the chat from Anna, and it's a good one. It was for me, but I think both of us can answer it. Got the book, and I'm loving it, but honest question, why is it all men? I found it surprising there weren't any women given time in it. Adam, I'm sure there's a chapter on Virginia McCaskey. There has to be. Yes.
Chapter number 2.
That was, Anna, that's a great question, and I can't deny that I actually thought of that. Obviously, the publisher thinks of the book. They come. This is a series of books, and they name it, obviously. But I went out of my way, and this is a little bit disappointing, to try to find a woman of impact in Blackhawks history, and there really hasn't been one. And will that change under Danny Wirtz? Maybe, or whoever the next president is, hopefully. But aside from, some front office people, and there's great ones who I know, Kelly Smith is one that I know from my years working in a radio broadcast, but there hasn't been a forward-facing woman in the Blackhawks organization yet. And when you think of a team that's been around since 1926, it's long overdue for that to change. And hopefully when volume 2 of the Big 50 is written, whenever that is, there will be several women that we can write about. But the fact is that the NHL especially is an old boys club. The same guys get the same jobs over and over. These families own these teams for centuries, and their sons take over. So I did actively try to find a forward-facing woman in Blackhawks franchise history, and truthfully, I could not do it. That needs to change. Hopefully, it should have changed years ago, but hopefully in the near future it will change, and they'll bring in some different hires for the front office or beyond. We just saw the Miami Marlins hire Kim Ng as their GM, which is great. It's a great step. But until this stops being the first woman and starts being a woman or a person was hired as a GM, and it's not even a story anymore, that's where we need to get. And hopefully, we can start in that direction, because I have to admit that the name of it rubbed me the wrong way too, because it does say men, and that's not inclusive. And I wanted to make sure if I could find one that there was a woman to highlight. And they're just, in Blackhawks history, sadly, there has not been.
Yeah, the Bears are. The NFL's making progress. There's women that are referees now. There's women on coaching staffs. There's women in front offices now. But the Chicago Bears have Virginia McCaskey, who is royalty. If you talk to anybody across the league, she's been there. She's just seen so much. Like the Bears' history is her history. The NFL's history is her history. So I not only did I want to story her, but I wanted to feature her prominently in this book. So she's the second chapter, right behind Walter Payton. I call her Mama Bear because that's what Jared Payton called her. And just to hear about all the personal relationships that players have built with her over the years, from the Paytons to the Tillman family, she's really, really revered by the player staff members. She's everything to them in so many different ways. So, yes, Virginia McCaskey, one of the matriarchs of the NFL, the owner of the Chicago Bears. Yeah, she's featured prominently. Second chapter in my book.
All right, got a question here in the chat from Nicholas. He says, for Adam and Jay, What was the most difficult part about writing your books? Adam, you just talked about everything that goes into writing a book, but what was the most challenging part? Adam, I'll let you start and then I'll answer.
Here's being a writer. This is my profession. The hardest thing is what to put in and what to leave out, and the editing process can be grueling, especially for me. I got some perfectionist qualities, and to have so many great anecdotes and trying to find every possible way to get them in the book was a problem. I don't want to say it's a problem, but it was a goal of mine to make sure every good story that I got found its way into this book in some capacity, whether it's split up over chapters or just featured separately. We made sure to do that. Going through the interview tape is just in terms of the process.
Yeah,
like
painstaking.
Hours. Yes, it's a painstaking process to go through every bit of audio. Like I said, Olin Kreutz and I had like an hour's worth of coffee, and that covered so many different topics other than himself. To go through that audio takes about maybe 2 or 3 days if you do it the right way and go through it verbatim. So that process is definitely, I wanted to try it because I do this for a living, but in terms of compiling it all for a book, it was a good goal for me.
I'm glad you said that because I am not a writer. That is not my. I do some writing, but I'm not a writer by any means. So part of me was sometimes it was finding enough to make a chapter. Sometimes it was selectively deleting things that maybe weren't as important. And to me, I'm a huge Hawks fan. It's all cool. It's all interesting to me. So sort of finding out what to cut out and what to keep was a bit of a challenge. The other thing was, as the Hawks, even in their heyday, were number 3, number 4 in town. So there wasn't as much written about them. There weren't as many columns written back in the day. And the chapter I had the hardest time writing was the one about Arthur Wirtz coming into power and the whole exchange of ownership with James Norris and that whole thing, because there's so little written about Major McLaughlin, the original owner of the team. There's very little written about that transition from McLaughlin to Wirtz. And, what I did learn, and it's funny, longtime Hawk fans will chuckle when they read this chapter about the Wirtz family. Arthur was not interested in winning. If the team won, great. He was interested in making money. And that carried on to his son, Bill, as many of us know very, very well.
Sounds about right.
Yes, it was definitely a business for Arthur and Bill Wirtz. Conversely, James Norris, who was his partner, who was their owner of the Red Wings as well, was all he cared about was winning. That was the main goal, was bringing championships. So while those two were partners in business, the way they ran their franchises were very, very different. And it's not just that. There's the I'll stop short of saying organized crime part of it, but fixing boxing matches and all sorts of really interesting stuff. How the story of the Wirtz family has not been made into a movie yet is unbelievable because it's got everything. It has everything. It's amazing. There's infighting. There's, like I said, there's gambling. There's a rise to power from Arthur Wirtz was a son of a policeman. He didn't come from money. It's all self-made in real estate. So the Wirtz empire, as much as I think people feel better about the Wirtz family now because of Rocky, but people of a certain age, when they hear Wirtz, they sort of cringe. To hear that rise of power and the way that family was built is quite remarkable. So me sort of having to find all that stuff and then write about it was a big challenge for me because I almost had to become historian in that moment because even Bob Verdi, the Blackhawks historian, who's been writing in this town forever, who was a great resource for me, when I would ask him about the really old days, he's like, I don't know. I couldn't even tell you. I was never around those people. I don't know how it went down. I have, stories that have been told over time, but when you're writing a book, you can't rely on word of mouth sort of thing. So that to me was the biggest challenge.
One of the cool things for me was actually going through like the old Chicago Daily News clips, the old Chicago Tribune clips from like the Bronco Nagurski days, or like the Hallis the player, or Hallis the coach days, like just to see how they wrote and see how they shared, highlights or quoted players and just relayed the information back then was compelling. I used some of those quotes from those stories as well, because it was just fascinating. Not just what like a Red Grange or a Sid Luckman was saying, but like how they wrote back then was a little bit different than today, in a sense, just about how sports writing has evolved. So I thought that was fun. I thought that was just extremely unique to be part of this book, where I focused on the modern era, again, the Tillmans, the Urlachers and whatnot, but to bring in some of these old archives, these stories, just it was compelling. And just the writing, being a writer myself, I thought it was cool just to see how they constructed sentences and opened up their stories. It was cool.
It was different back then, right? And I think,
yeah,
writers from that era, it was more poetic the way they wrote, right? Instead of just the news, the facts, which is what a journalist is supposed to present, to have them sort of the way they would. I always think of it, the movie Slapshot, and this is the 70s, but the way Dickie Dunn describes the Chiefs, flowing down the ice, the striking white of their jersey, that's from an era past. People don't really write that way anymore, and I think there is that extreme kind of pressure on people in your role, Adam, to remain objective and to not romanticize athletes and teams in this era, and that's probably the correct way to do it. But back then, it wasn't quite like that, and it's cool that I got to read some of those stories, and you did as well. It was cool to sort of look back, literally going to the library and looking at microfiche, reading old newspaper articles about the Hawks and Bears. Something I never thought I would do in my lifetime for a project. But yeah, it was cool to compare the way sports writers wrote then and the way they write now.
Yeah, there's nostalgia in it. It's the way they described Rockwell Nagurski running into the wall at Wrigley Field and leaving a dent that would last forever. It's just, like that's, maybe I could use some of that, maybe use some of that in this book, in the way I write every day about, Nick Foles and Mitch Trubisky.
Yeah, but see, the problem, though, it's not a problem. What made it easier back then was you could write that story and it just became truth for all time. But if you wrote, yesterday that, Roquan Smith ran into the brick wall and there's a dent, 50 people would go to Soldier Field and like, there's a picture of the wall. There's no dent there. That story's BS.
So it's, nowadays you're quoting tweets and Instagram posts,
right,
and all these other things. So,
but for like in this era, urban legends can't grow because they could be debunked so quickly that there's not even an opportunity for that to happen, which is kind of a shame. Everyone's got a story of, is the most, he tackled him so hard his shoes fell off, and I'll have to take your word for it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like even the Gale Sayers game, at Wrigley Field, to hear them describe that one, everybody knows it was a muddy mess. You hear Mike Ditka mention it and whatnot, but like to read about it, like they played that game in a monsoon, according to the Chicago Tribune. It was just, of course. It was different. It was cool.
All right, I've got some Bears questions here for you. Just so like we're going to interview about the modern team. By the way, if you want to order our books, Adam Jahns is the author of The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Bears. My name is Jay Zawaski from The Score and the Madhouse podcast. I'm the author of The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Blackhawks. If you click that link there on the page, you'll save 10% on both books with promo code EVENT. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and joining us here. I know there's a lot of things to do. So for taking an hour out of your night, we greatly appreciate it. Again, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat there. I hope I say this name correct. Saif Khan has a question for Adam. He says, been listening to your podcast since the end of 2017. I have two questions for you. Who do you think Matt Nagy will start if both QBs are healthy against Green Bay? And do you think Mitch could be better than he was since he was on the bench for so long? Do you think it could affect him in a positive way? By the way, for the record, I'm Team Mitch.
Good, because here's my bold prediction. Mitch Trubisky is going to start Sunday night in Green Bay, even if Nick Foles is healthy. I just think it's, Jay, what else do you have to lose? This is, besides the season, but like you're already down to 5-5 after starting 5-1. Juan Castillo today already referenced, maybe going back to what they did in weeks 1 and 2 in terms of run game. So Trubisky started those games. Bring him along as well.
All right. See, I feel the same way because I feel he should, because we've seen what Foles can do, and he can efficient himself to average. I can get you to the red zone. I just can't get you in the end zone. And Mitch Trubisky can be inaccurate and he can make some bad decisions, but Foles is doing the same thing. But at least Mitch can keep a play alive, and at least
Yeah.
Mitch can get a ball to a receiver on time. So I feel like I'm the last guy that has some belief in Mitch Trubisky and whatever. And when they put Foles in, it was the right thing to do. But anyway, we'll see. Got a question here from I think it's Jorge. He says, Jay, what are your impressions of the Hawks expanding their ties to the Hispanic community now that they have their games in Spanish and the positive impact of their dynasty on communities that wouldn't watch hockey? Well, look, for me, and I talked about this a little bit earlier with the lack of women in the Blackhawks organization, any step towards inclusion to me is a very positive thing. And look, business wise, it's good for the team to have more people watching and more people interested. Also, just acknowledging the existence of people that don't look like me as your fans is a good thing to do too. And I think the more communities the Blackhawks reach out to, the better. And this came up this month too. It's Native American Heritage Month. And the Blackhawks early in the month were doing a lot of highlighting of some Native American cultural stories and sharing the story of who Chief Blackhawk actually was. Steps like that go a long way. And if you missed it this week, the league unveiled their reverse retro jerseys. Every team in the league is getting some play on their old jerseys with the colors sort of swapped. So the Boston Bruins have a yellow jersey with black trim. The Hawks is more black with red. And when they presented the Blackhawks jersey, the model was very much trying to obscure the Native American logo on the chest. And I feel like that's something that probably will need to be addressed sooner than later. I don't know how much longer that logo is going to be around or how much longer it should be around. This is a very hot topic, and I know a lot of people disagree with me on it, and that's fine. That's why everyone's got an opinion, and it's great. But when you see the league sort of actively, you've got all 31 teams on a graph there, and they're all forward-facing except the guy in the Hawks jersey. He's got his back, his back to the lens when you see Blackhawks across his back. That tells you that there's something there, and the league is aware of it, and they're not super happy about it. So the more inclusion, the better, to answer your question. Hispanic community, Black community, everybody, they've been saying hockey is for everyone for a decade now. They've got to show it. They've got to prove it. And these little steps they take, especially the Blackhawks, who are an Original Six franchise, they're one of the most powerful franchises in the league. They've got a little more cachet when it comes to these things. So the things they do are more impactful than if the Carolina Hurricanes did it or the Arizona Coyotes did it. If the Chicago Blackhawks are doing it, it sends a different message and a stronger message. So for me, the more the better. The more inclusion, the better. Bring everybody in. You can never have too many people on the bandwagon.
Absolutely. I'll take a question here from my guy, Nicholas Marino. You notice so in my book, there's a lot of, it looks like it's like every chapter is like a feature story. So this is his question. Did you feel that way when writing your book? And does having individual chapters on particular people or moments help when trying to write a book? I don't know how you felt, Jay, but at one point, it's how I approached it, is that every story, every chapter should be something all into itself. And if there are points where I could tie it into other chapters, I'll do that. Maybe I could tie things in by the sequence of chapters, the order that I put them in. But yes, the way I started to arrange it was I had a Google Doc for every single chapter, and I would take these transcripts and drop in the quotes to each and every one and make sure to add certain context to go with those quotes. But just in terms of building it, it helped keep my mind sane. As I was pounding Starbucks after Starbucks, that, like, Jay, no lie, I spent like 7 hours a day, for weeks on end, at Starbucks, and like there would be breakfast there, there'd be a lunch there, and eventually I'd go home to dinner to my family. But when it became to finalize the project that we worked on, like there's a healthy, unhealthy intake of caffeine and a lot of money spent at Starbucks.
No, there's no doubt about that. And I have been a procrastinator my whole life. And that was one of my fears about writing this book was, how much of this am I going to put off? How much of it am I going to have to cram into the last 2 or 3 months? So got the assignment, probably finished the first 10, 15 chapters in the first couple months and felt good about it. And I'm like, all right, now that I know the pace of it and what it takes to write a chapter, I can slow down. Well, that's a big mistake because, of course, the first 10, 15 chapters I wrote were things I was very passionate about, things I knew a lot about, things I have been waiting to sort of talk about for a long time. So they flew out of my brain, out of the paper, and I just needed some facts and some quotes to sort of back up what I was saying. When I got into the minutia sort of stuff, that's what took a really long time. And you spent your time at Starbucks. We've been in our new home in Homewood for 3 years. And we have what is now my office, the room I'm in now, which is very nice, was at the time I was writing it, basically our storage room. So I had to climb over a bunch of boxes and storage things to get to a desk to write. And I would just sit down here in this room full of stuff with no distractions. And like you said, it was a full-time job, Adam. And I've been at the score for 20 years, so I have a lot of vacation time. I stored it all up until that book was due. And I think I took 2 of the last 3 weeks of the year off and was basically down here from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, just grinding this thing out. So now that it's here, now that it's done, very rewarding, very cool that we get to do stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I would say worth it. But man, in those moments, I was like, man, what would it take to just say, you know what, pull the plug. I don't know how I'm going to finish this thing, but with the support, I'm sure same thing, Adam, support of your family and friends really helps you get through. And I think just having that, the realization of when this is done, this will be out there forever. And, it's something I'll be proud. You can add author to your resume and you're not lying about it. And that's significant. My wife, the day my book came out, my wife got me this mug. This is what a published author looks like. She's like, you have to use that for your thing. I'm like, okay, fine. Yeah. But it's true. It's cool. So I'm taking a lot of pride in it. I'm sure you are too, Adam. It's a huge accomplishment to do. And as hard as it is for me to take credit for something I did, this was significant. And I think both of us realize that. And we're grateful for the opportunity to be here with Barber's Bookstores. Remember, if you want to buy either book, hit that link. You can buy both books too. They make a great gift if you want to buy multiple. Use that code EVENT to save 10% on your order. Got a question here about the Bears from Samuel. He says, how Bears would it be if Mitch wins the next 6 games and leads them to the playoffs, but they lose in the first round? Bears Brain Trust then brings back Pace, Nagy, and Mitch for 2021, only for a potential rerun of the 2019 and 20 seasons.
Well, I don't like covering coaching changes, so I may take it. So, deal. Yeah. Well, just to be realistic, I think before the season, my prediction was 9-7. Right now, they probably look like an 8-8 team. Like I can't see them losing out or even going 2-4. I think at worst they go 500 over these final 6 games. But the quarterback position is everything. It has been, everything. And even coming up with chapters for this book, there was, you got Sid Luckman. You have a huge chapter on Jay Cutler because he's the most polarizing athlete in Bears history, maybe Chicago sports history.
You might be right.
Yeah. So
who else would it be?
Exactly. Just, Mitch Trubisky can make an argument, or he had one going for a little bit until Matt Nagy benched him and put an end to that. But here we are talking about Mitch. There's a chapter on the Mitch Trubisky trade because, look, love him or hate him, that moment in Bears history was extremely important. This was this GM's huge swing at trying to get that quarterback position right. When you trade up to the number 2 overall pick, that is definitely a moment that has to be storied. I think I have them in the 11th or 12th chapter because that's how important I think it was, especially considering like the modern Bears.
Well, it's franchise altering, right? If you get it right, you're set for a long time. And if you get it wrong, you're fired. And so far, it looks like it's wrong. It's funny. I would sort of want to spend some time on that Cutler theory of him being the most polarizing athlete in Chicago. And you mentioned Mitch. I think most people like Mitch. Like, he seems like a good dude, nice guy. Like, I think people in Chicago are rooting for him and would be happy obviously they'd be happy if he was a good quarterback. But I don't think anyone's happy that he is failing. But Jay always had, the personality wasn't right for everybody all the time either. So to me, that's a great question. Who is the most polarized? I can't think of who else it would be, because the other people, if you want to say, okay, Dennis Rodman had great success here, and I think most people like him. Sosa, maybe Sammy Sosa, because some Cubs fans love him, some Cubs fans hate him, but beyond that, I think it's Cutler by a mile.
I don't think there's a position in Chicago, that has the scrutiny as playing quarterback for the Chicago Bears, whether it's from the media, the fans, or just there's nothing like it. And it's just like you would think they would get it right at some point. That's what kind of like
yeah, your mind luck into it.
Like even like in the books, like this story's out there. So it's them removing Joe Montana's name from their board, and because they thought they needed a backup running back for Walter Payton, and that was Jim Finks. That was Jim Finks, like the best GM, in Bears history, the architect of the '85 Bears, and it blows your mind sometimes, because at some point you would think they would just get lucky, right? Like just get lucky.
Once.
Yes, once, but I guess not. We'll see. They're not going anywhere. There's plenty of time to get it right.
It's just the overthinking of it all. The Trubisky pick, it's so overthought. Deshaun Watson was right there with all the evidence that he should be taken there, and just to try to outsmart yourself. And the thing is, if you draft Deshaun Watson and it doesn't work out, no one is going to say you should have taken Trubisky, right? No one's going to say you were wrong. Even if Mitch panned out to be the next Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes, you say, look, here's the body of evidence for Watson, here's the body of evidence for Mitch, and it's obvious what the pick should have been made. And like you said, Jim Finks taking a backup running back instead of Joe Montana, you're just stop overthinking. Just do the right thing. That's the frustrating part. And, we've seen the Bears pass on quarterbacks before, but I think part of what adds insult to the injury is you've had the Packers have two of the best quarterbacks ever back to back with no gap in between. It was Favre, it was Rodgers, and who knows what's next, right? Like they have two of the best quarterbacks in the history of the game back to back, while the Bears can't get, Jay Cutler is the best they've had, and Cutler was fine.
Yeah.
He was like middle of the road starter, but to see your main rival do it right twice in a row and trade for Favre when he wasn't a totally proven commodity, and to identify that talent, it just makes it that much more frustrating.
So yes, Jay, this is a Bears book, but chapter.
You've got yours with you too?
Yeah. Sure. So chapter 31, Jay.
All right.
Brett and Aaron. So if you're gonna go outside the box and think about opponents who have defined the Bears a bit, those are the guys.
Is there a Don Majkowski reference?
Oh gosh, sure.
Now that's the guy the Bears would get.
Yes.
Don Majkowski's like, hey, he's fine. Hey, if you're a really good team, he'll get you to the playoffs maybe. But oh man,
they don't have that transcendent one. If Cutler's the most polarizing athlete, and I always love that conversation or that debate in Chicago, like what's the other one? The best free agent signing in Chicago sports history. I think the Blackhawks have it. With all due respect to what the Cubs built, for this World Series, Marian Hossa with the 3 cups, and you got into it in your book too. Like I think in terms of debates, it ends there with Marian Hossa. He was the best free agent signing, in Chicago sports history.
Yeah, and I think people are going to say, "What about or Dennis Rodman? That was a trade."
Yeah.
A lot of the big ones were trades, not free agent signings. So you got to remember that. John Lester has an argument. Came to Chicago, won a World Series, was a huge part of the Cubs' success. But Hossa's got 3, and he was a huge part of those 3. They might not win any of those 3 without him. And to get him, not just the fact that they signed him and he was what they thought he would be and they had success, but that was, I think Brian Campbell might have been like the first one where the Hawks, for the first time in my lifetime, got the guy. On day one of free agency, it was 2009. or it was the summer of '08 when they signed Brian Campbell to a huge contract. They won. They got the top free agent prize that year. He went on and they went to the conference final against Marian Hossa in Detroit. Then the next summer, usually the day of free agency, all the big names go right away, right? And a couple linger. And I remember I was in Lamont looking at apartments when the Hawks signed Marian Hossa. I was standing on the steps of an apartment I was about to look at. And the day had gone by, and there were some rumors that the Hawks were sniffing around, but nothing had really happened. And Martin Havlat was there, and he needed a deal too. And it felt like, all right, they're going to bring back Havlat. That's probably the safer thing to do. And then all of a sudden, the Hawks signed Marian Hossa. And it was from that moment on, you knew that the Hawks were going to do everything in their power to win a Stanley Cup, which is something I never thought in my lifetime. Like we talked about earlier with the Wirtz family, it wasn't about winning. It was about making money. And how can we make the most money without spending any? The Hawks went out 2 years in a row and signed the two best available free agents. And Hossa was a luxury. They were already a really good team with Keith and Seabrook and Toews and Kane on the rise. And Marty Havlat would have been fine there too. But they said, screw it. We need this last piece to get over the hump. Brought in Marian Hossa and won 3 cups. Funny, we're talking about that today. Marian Hossa got his bust in the Hall of Fame. Very cool. So, his plaque. It's a plaque in the Hockey Hall of Fame. But I don't think, when you look at what was accomplished by the team, what was accomplished by the player throughout their time here, I don't think there's much question that Hossa is the best free agent in Chicago sports history.
Joel Quenneville, Q, would always call him the perfect hockey player.
He was.
That description a few times. And I mean, the Hawks reached the Western Conference Final. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Marty Havlat was on that team that lost to the Red Wings, right? They go out and get Hossa the next year, and I know he was injured. I think to start his tenure with the Hawks, but just an underrated superstar in so many different ways. He was a great dude too. I got to know him a little bit when I covered that team. Just good personality, good sense of humor, good family guy, and just an outstanding hockey player. Like one of the best, like the way he skated with the puck just so strongly and fended off guys. There were times where as good as Kane was, as good as Toews was, as fast as Keith was, we're like, oh, Marian Hossa, he might be the best player on this team and just doesn't get the credit for it.
No, he's such a complete player. The strength you mentioned, he's as good defensively as he is offensively. I remember a sequence where it was him and Pavel Datsyuk. Hossa had the puck, Datsyuk took it away. Hossa chased him down, took it away. Two of the guys who are, known for their two-way play, guys that were teammates for a while, to see that exchange. And I think part of the reason Hossa is maybe a little bit unsung is because he doesn't have that breakaway speed. He doesn't score highlight reel goals. He's just great at everything. Every part of the game, Marian Hossa is great at. And, he was never didn't put up huge numbers all the time, but he would score 30 goals. He scored I think he scored 50 in Atlanta, or maybe it was Ottawa, whenever it was. But just an elite talent that found a way to, as his career went on, to adapt his game to the team's needs. And Nashville Game 5 in 2010 is a great example. When they needed a big moment, Marian Hossa was there to deliver more often than not.
Jay, we got a question here, and I like this. I think this is from Samuel again. Games that happened in the city of Chicago, which are the most memorable Bears and Hawks games that you covered? I'm curious about what those games meant for the city of Chicago and the fans at that time. I'll go first. So 2010 was just full of those games, right?
Yeah.
It was just an astounding, incredible season. Speaking of Marian Hossa, it was that game against Nashville, Game 5 at the United Center. I don't think I've ever heard the building that loud in the entirety that I covered the team. It was shaking, literally shaking. It was that loud. It's the game winner out of the penalty box, against the Nashville Predators. Celebration like this, that was, in terms of Hawks games, I mean, there's nothing like it. All the Canucks games were fun. Those were always rowdy. But, that game against the Predators, there was literally nothing. I can't compare it to anything else of any teams. I didn't cover the Cubs during the World Series run. But that game against the Hawks in 2010 was something special.
That is hugely memorable. The other part about that game is up until that point, that game was a slog.
Yeah.
It was frustrating and it was slow, and the Hawks couldn't get anything done. And they really had to grind out that win. And to come out on top, they were about to go down 3-2 ahead of Nashville, right? And yeah, they would have been down 3-2 had they lost that game. And then heading on the road, that would have been really, really tough. So that's a huge game. The one for me that stood out throughout the dynasty, and this is probably more for personal reasons than anything, 2013, the Hawks are the best team in hockey. There's no doubt about it. They get out to a great start, record-setting year, awesome. They get up against the Detroit Red Wings, and they get down in the series 3-1. And me as an old Hawks fan with PTSD from the Red Wings, whenever I see that winged wheel, I get the shakes just because I'm so used to – I've been to so many games where the Hawks were – they're up 2 with 3 minutes left, and Detroit wins it in regulation somehow just because they're Detroit and they have that ability. And it seemed they always did that against the Hawks. So for the Hawks to come back from down 3-1, it looks like they win the game late in the third, and Nicholas Hjalmarsson scores, but a penalty way behind the play, offsetting penalties with Brandon Saad. The goal's waved off. Game goes to overtime, and then Brent Seabrook pretty promptly in overtime ends the game with a bit of a knuckle shot. It didn't look like anything when he took it. But to come back down 3-1 to the team that has been a thorn in your side for 3 decades, whatever it's been, that to me is the game I'll always remember, because I had such doubt in my soul that they were going to be able to come back. Because, again, the Red Wings had just always had their number.
Yeah.
And a few years prior, they had knocked them out of the Western Conference Final. And I wanted no part of the Red Wings just because of that. Like, I don't care who they play. I just don't want to play Detroit. And they played Detroit, and they finally I think the chapter is called Slaying the Dragon. And that's how it felt to me. I do want to mention one other game. It's not a Bears game or a Cubs game, or a Hawks game, rather. But 2015, when the Cubs eliminated the Cardinals, Wrigley Field was shaking. I was there. So I was there when they won that game to advance to the NLCS, and the Cardinals. They ended up losing, obviously. I was there when they won the pennant in 16. It was so much louder when they eliminated the Cardinals. That was the game that Javi hit a home run. Schwarber put one over the scoreboard. That famous Schwarber home run that landed on top of the Budweiser sign. That, to me, was the loudest sporting event I've ever attended. And Wrigley Field it felt like it was rocking. It was so loud in there. And that was another one of those moments where it's the Cardinals.
Yeah.
And they're the team that's always got it. They're always going to beat us no matter what happens. And the Cubs got down early, and they came back, and they won that. I mean, that game was tense. I think part of the NLCS thing was the Cubs got into a big lead early, so a lot of the drama was taken out of it. But man, that game against the Cardinals in 2015 might have been the loudest sporting event I attended, aside from the All-Star game at the Chicago Stadium, which I did attend and wrote a chapter about there as well. So if you want to check out our books, Adam Jahns from The Athletic, his book is The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Bears. Mine is The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Blackhawks. My name is Jay Zawaski from 670 The Score and the Madhouse podcast. Remember, click that link down there. I don't know if it's on your screen this way, but it's on mine this way. That promo code EVENT will save you 10% on your purchase. So we've got a few minutes left to go. So if anyone has any questions they've been waiting to get in, feel free to put them in the chat there. There we go. Got one from Anna. She says, question for Jay. As a writer and a fan, how did you balance writing about players who had big hockey contributions at the time, but personal controversies later in life? It seems like a difficult balance up to the minute references in sports without acknowledging things we know about the players. What was your process for this? That was a difficult thing. And I felt that the big one for me was Bobby Hull. And Bobby Hull has made some very unfortunate comments. There's been some very unfortunate incidents with him. And if I have some regrets about the book, is that maybe I didn't cover that enough. But I felt that the project wasn't the time or place to address that. This was more of a love letter to the Blackhawks, this book. That's kind of the idea of this series. And look, I've publicly acknowledged Bobby Hull's problems before, the things he said before. That's why he was definitely not chapter 1 for me, or even close to the top, because of the things that have happened with him off the ice. But to deny his place in franchise history would be foolish. So I approach this book as a love letter to the Blackhawks, but I've given my thoughts on Bobby Hull many, many times in many, many different forums. But I do think, looking back on it, maybe I should have done a better job of acknowledging some of the unfortunate off the ice stuff with him too, because I don't know, it happened, and maybe you can't tell the story of the man without getting into that part of it. So maybe a bit of a regret for me, but in the headspace I'm at the time, trying to wrap up the book and everything, it's tough. And Adam, I know something came to light this week about George Halas. I'm trying to remember who was talking about it on Twitter, that he was sort of actively against black players coming into the NFL. I don't know if that was part of your process of writing it all, if you covered it at all at the time. But all these guys, look, when you're writing about rich white men from 60 years ago, there's going to be some really, really bad stuff in there, and it's hard to avoid. It really is. It's hard to find a perfect person from any era, but especially one that was so segregated and so so divided.
Yeah, my George Halas chapter does touch on the ban on African American players by the NFL. That's part of their history, and it's part of George Halas's history. So there is chapters. There's a part of the chapter, I should say, is devoted to that era and George Halas's place in it. To what you were saying earlier about like the players. Like for me, like it was. Will be Brian Urlacher. My book was finished when he had his tweets and messages on social media. So just in terms of like the process, it was done. So there was nothing I could do. The book was published, but as I thought about it, and because it bothers you a bit, just in terms of what messages he was trying to convey, and
right. Yep.
you just. I don't think what he was saying on social media changed who he was as a teammate, because the whole chapter is kind of wrapped around about how he was such a beloved teammate, like the perfect teammate. And that was a resounding message from so many different players that I interviewed. Like he was like their favorite teammate. Devin Hester called him a true leader. So many things that were said about him as a player, I still think will always apply. So I think time changes. I think, social media is now part of our daily lives, and it's revealed things about certain people. But just in terms of the book and the Brian Urlacher chapter, like I don't think what he shares on social media now changes who he was as a teammate to those players back then. That makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And it is a delicate balance, and you want to make sure that you're not flat out ignoring those things. But the book is about these players' times with the Bears and with the Blackhawks. And if you were going to write a biography of Bobby Hull or Brian Urlacher, then yeah, those things would have to be included. But when you're trying to keep it to 300, 400 words per chapter, and you got to cover who they were on the ice or on the gridiron, you got to balance that out a little bit. And you kind of have to, like I said earlier, go with the mood of the thing you're working on, right?
Yeah.
If it's this is truly is a love letter to the Hawks and to the Bears, as it should be. And I think that's what people are looking for in this book, and that's what they're going to get. But I appreciate, Anna, all the tough questions. It's great. These are things that I've wanted to be asked because I've wanted to address them, quite frankly, because they've been, since I finished this almost a year ago, it's been on my mind, like, yeah, should I have gone harder on this or that, or should I have excluded this and included this? I don't know. And I think every author, whether they're a novelist or whatever, will always have that sort of that doubt. Even a musician would say, should I have played this chord here instead of that chord? But it's done, and it's on paper, it's recorded or whatever, and you can't go back. But I think every, whatever you want to say, artist has those sort of regrets when they look back on their project sometimes.
I think one thing, Jay, I've always tried to keep in mind when covering professional sports is that athletes are people too. Sometimes we tend to look at them in this superhero capacity, but they're people with their own fears, prejudices, concerns off the field, problems at home. They are people too. They come from different situations, and I've always tried to keep that in mind while trying to convey, their stories as they become, successful, or whether or not they fail on the field or ice or court or whatever. you get me.
Yes, whatever the playing surface is, there will be failures on and off of them. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in and for the great questions, Adam, Jahns, and I greatly appreciate it. Thanks
Thank
to
you so
Laura
much.
from, Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to jump over you.
Just want to say, thank you for everybody checking in. A special thanks, to my own wife and family, my beautiful wife, Colleen, for putting up with me throughout this book process. And yes, thanks for everybody, for checking in with us today. And, be sure to check out that event code, Barbara's Books.
And definitely thank you to Barbara's Books. Thanks to Laura for running this entire thing. We greatly appreciate it. Again, save 10% on both of our books with the code EVENT. Seeing here in the chat, this will be available on YouTube if you got in late or if you had to tune out early. But if you had to tune out early, you wouldn't be hearing this. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. It's available on YouTube when you want to watch it. But thanks again. I am Jay Zawaski. I'm the author of The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Blackhawks. Adam Jahns of The Athletic is the author of The Big 50, The Men and Moments That Made the Chicago Bears. Thank you to Barbara's Bookstores. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening, and keep your eye on my Twitter at JayZawaski670. Adam, you're at Adam_Jahns. Is that correct?
Adam Jahns, Jahns.
All right. So, we'll be other events, other signings, all sorts of things. So just keep an eye on our social media. And, of course, make sure you follow Barbara's Bookstore. I'm trying to go back and find the Twitter account. I know it was put up here. I think it's just Barbara's Bookstores or at Barbara's Bookstores, but barbarasbookstores.com for everything you need from them. Remember that promo code EVENT to save 10% on our books. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your week and have a great weekend. Stay healthy, most of all.
Yes.